The greatest legends are never welcomed at the castle gate. The cold morning wind carried those words across the stone bridge as Emily Carter rode silently toward Blackthorn Castle inside a weathered wooden carriage guarded by soldiers who never once looked her in the eye. To them, she was nothing more than the final condition of a fragile peace treaty. A young woman traded from one kingdom to another so two rulers could avoid another generation of conflict. The banners of her homeland disappeared behind rolling hills while the towering black walls of the Wolf King's kingdom slowly rose above the surrounding forest like an ancient mountain carved by time itself. Emily kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her calm emerald eyes studying every tree that lined the narrow road. Most travelers admired the towering pines or the distant waterfalls pouring down rocky cliffs, but Emily noticed something different. Several birds abandoned the western branches at exactly the same moment. A family of deer quietly crossed the river far earlier than they normally would. Even the wind carried the faint scent of freshly disturbed earth from somewhere deep inside the forest. She said nothing. She had learned many years ago that people rarely listened until it was too late. The soldiers escorting her laughed among themselves. One of them glanced toward the carriage and shook his head. "Poor girl," he muttered. "She has no idea what kind of kingdom she is entering." Another answered with a grin. "She should worry more about meeting the Wolf King than the forest." Emily heard every word without reacting. Their assumptions felt familiar. Nearly everyone who looked at her saw an ordinary young woman wearing a simple traveling dress beneath a gray cloak. They never noticed the quiet confidence hidden behind her gentle smile or the remarkable patience reflected in her steady eyes. Hours later, the road curved around a steep cliff before revealing Blackthorn Castle in its full glory. Massive stone towers overlooked endless forests stretching toward distant mountains. Silver banners bearing the royal wolf crest fluttered proudly above towering walls, while armored guards watched every traveler crossing the bridge below. The carriage rolled beneath the enormous gates, its wooden wheels echoing across polished stone. Servants gathered quietly along the courtyard, whispering to one another as Emily stepped onto the ground. Some expected fear, others expected tears. Instead, they found a composed young woman calmly observing her unfamiliar surroundings with thoughtful curiosity. She briefly looked toward the eastern forest where thick mist lingered beneath the towering pines. Something there felt strangely familiar, although she had never visited Blackthorn Kingdom before. Inside the Great Hall, King Adrian Blackwood stood before the high throne speaking with Captain Rowan Hale and several royal advisors. Tall stained glass windows filled the chamber with soft afternoon light, while blazing fireplaces warmed the ancient stone walls. Adrian possessed the calm authority expected of a ruler who had spent years protecting his people through wisdom rather than pride. When the chamber doors opened and Emily entered, every conversation gradually faded into silence. Noble families studied her with open curiosity. Several exchanged disappointed glances. This was not the powerful political alliance they had imagined. She looked too quiet, too gentle, too ordinary. Adrian observed her for several long moments before offering a respectful nod instead of the formal welcome everyone expected. Emily returned the gesture with equal dignity. Neither spoke immediately. Something almost impossible to explain settled between them, not recognition, but the unmistakable feeling that destiny had quietly shifted. As the formal introductions began, a sudden flock of ravens burst into the sky outside the eastern windows. Emily instinctively turned toward the sound. Adrian noticed. So did Rowan. The birds were not fleeing the castle. They were fleeing something hidden much deeper within the forest. While the nobles continued discussing treaties, ceremonies, and royal customs, Emily remained focused on the distant tree line where the unnatural silence had already begun spreading. Unknown to everyone standing inside Blackthorn Castle, the kingdom had not received a helpless bride that day. It had unknowingly welcomed the one woman capable of understanding the ancient danger slowly awakening beneath its forgotten woods. The following morning unfolded beneath a sky of pale blue as sunlight spilled across the towering walls of Blackthorn Castle, revealing a kingdom that appeared peaceful to every visitor except Emily Carter. She stood beside the tall windows of her chamber overlooking the eastern forest, watching ribbons of morning mist drift slowly between endless rows of ancient pine trees. The castle had awakened with the familiar rhythm of daily life. Blacksmiths hammered glowing steel inside the lower courtyard. Stable hands prepared horses for patrol. Servants carried baskets of fresh bread through winding stone corridors, while distant bells echoed from the highest tower. Yet beneath those ordinary sounds, Emily sensed an unusual silence spreading from the forest. The birds that had greeted sunrise only moments earlier had suddenly stopped singing. Even the breeze seemed hesitant as it passed over the treetops. She quietly stepped away from the window without mentioning her concerns. Experience had taught her that warnings without proof often became reasons for ridicule rather than caution. As she entered the main courtyard, conversations softened the moment several noblewomen noticed her. Their polite smiles lasted only long enough to satisfy royal manners before quiet whispers replaced them. To them, she remained nothing more than a political exchange, a stranger delivered across the border to preserve peace. One young nobleman glanced toward her simple dress before speaking softly enough that he believed she could not hear. She hardly looks prepared for life beside the Wolf King. Another answered with a faint laugh. Perhaps she only needs to remain quiet. Emily continued walking without changing her pace. She neither defended herself nor acknowledged the remarks. Instead, her attention shifted toward a pair of castle hounds resting near the eastern gate. Both animals had lifted their heads toward the distant forest, their ears alert while refusing to leave the shelter of the stone wall. That behavior troubled her far, more than careless gossip ever could. Across the courtyard, King Adrian Blackwood observed the scene while speaking with Captain Rowan Hale. He noticed that Emily never reacted to insults, yet she reacted immediately to the smallest changes within the natural world. Rowan unfolded a newly delivered patrol report across a wooden table. Another northern trail has been abandoned, he explained. No signs of conflict. No damaged supplies. The patrol simply chose a different route without reporting why. Adrian studied the map before looking toward the eastern hills. How many unusual reports have arrived this week? 7, Rowan answered. Each one mentions strange behavior among the wildlife, but none of the scouts can explain it. Adrian remained silent for several moments before his eyes settled once again upon Emily as she slowly crossed the gardens. He remembered how she had instinctively turned toward the ravens the previous afternoon before anyone else even noticed them. It could have been coincidence. Yet coincidences were beginning to gather with uncomfortable frequency. Later that afternoon, Emily wandered through the castle gardens where climbing roses covered ancient stone walls warmed by gentle sunlight. She paused beside a narrow stream flowing beneath a small wooden bridge and quietly watched fallen leaves drifting across the water. One leaf suddenly reversed direction despite the current. Emily frowned almost imperceptibly before glancing toward the surrounding trees. The wind had changed again. Moments later, Captain Rowan approached with courteous respect. "Lady Emily, His Majesty hopes your first day has been comfortable." Emily offered a grateful smile. "Everyone has been generous." Rowan hesitated before asking, "May I ask what caught your attention just now?" Emily looked toward the forest beyond the garden walls. "The wind carries different stories each day," she replied calmly. "Today it carries questions." Rowan followed her gaze, but saw nothing except distant trees moving beneath afternoon light. Before he could speak again, the castle watchtower sounded a single warning horn. Guards immediately turned toward the eastern gate as a weary scout rode into the courtyard. His horse slowed to a trembling stop, covered with dust from the mountain roads. The young messenger climbed down and bowed respectfully before the king. "Your Majesty," he said, struggling to catch his breath. The Eastern Patrol found another abandoned campsite. The fires were still warm, but there was no sign of the people who built them. Silence settled across the courtyard. Emily closed her eyes for only a brief moment, as though confirming something she already feared. When she opened them again, her calm expression remained unchanged, but deep within she knew the forest had already begun revealing its warning. The question was no longer whether something hidden had awakened beneath the ancient trees. The only question that remained was whether anyone would recognize the truth before the silence reached the castle itself. The uneasy quiet that settled over Blackthorn Castle lingered well into the next morning, but life inside its towering walls continued as though nothing had changed. Servants polished the great hall, merchants arrived with wagons full of grain and cloth, and young guards practiced their formations beneath the watchful eyes of veteran captains. Only the conversations had changed. Every corridor carried whispers about abandoned campsites, restless animals, and the strange reports arriving from the eastern forest. Emily Carter listened without appearing to listen at all as she slowly walked through the open marketplace inside the castle walls. Her emerald eyes drifted naturally from one detail to another. Fresh wagon tracks crossed the courtyard in uneven patterns. A flock of sparrows suddenly abandoned a rooftop all at once before circling toward the northern hills. Even the castle horses shifted uneasily inside their stables whenever the breeze arrived from the east. Most people noticed none of it. To Emily, every small change fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had not yet revealed its full picture. Near the training grounds, King Adrian Blackwood stood beside Captain Rowan Hale as dozens of soldiers completed another morning exercise. The captain handed the king a fresh collection of patrol reports. Adrian read each page carefully before folding them together with a thoughtful expression. Every scout describes the forest differently, Rowan observed. One claims the trails are quieter than ever. Another insists the birds are flying in unusual directions. None of them agree. Adrian remained silent for a moment before asking, "What do they all have in common?" Rowan considered the question before answering. Every report mentions instinct. None of the men could explain why they changed their route. They simply felt that they should. Adrian slowly looked across the courtyard toward Emily, who had stopped beside an old stone fountain. She was watching the surface of the water rather than the people around her. A single leaf floated across the fountain before spinning gently against the current. Emily tilted her head almost imperceptibly, then glanced toward the eastern walls. Adrian noticed the movement. It was the same quiet awareness she had shown since arriving at the castle. She never searched for attention, yet her instincts always seemed one step ahead of everyone else. Curiosity quietly replaced his earlier caution. Emily continued toward the gardens, where flowering vines climbed weathered stone arches. She paused beneath a tall oak tree whose branches stretched toward the distant forest. A young castle gardener smiled politely as he trimmed rose bushes nearby. "The flowers have opened earlier than expected this year," he said cheerfully. Emily returned the smile before looking toward the trees. Sometimes nature prepares long before people realize there is a reason. The gardener looked around in confusion. Everything appeared perfectly normal to him. Emily did not explain further because she knew he would only see peaceful gardens, bright sunshine, and calm skies. He would not notice that the butterflies had disappeared from the flowers or that the squirrels had abandoned the tallest branches. Those small details spoke clearly to someone who understood how the natural world whispered before it shouted. Later that afternoon, Adrian walked alone along the eastern battlements overlooking the endless sea of pine trees. The forest appeared beautiful, beneath warm sunlight, but something about its silence unsettled him. Rowan soon joined him carrying a rolled map marked with recent patrol routes. "The eastern trails remain untouched today," Rowan reported. "No merchant caravans have requested permission to travel through them." Adrian accepted the map without taking his eyes off the horizon. People avoid danger long before they understand it. Rowan hesitated before speaking again. "Your Majesty, may I ask something?" Adrian nodded. "Have you noticed Lady Emily watching the forest almost every chance she gets?" Adrian answered quietly. "I have noticed far more than that." Before Rowan could continue, a shadow crossed the battlements. Both men looked upward as a magnificent hawk circled above the castle, instead of flying toward its usual hunting grounds. It completed 2 slow circles before turning sharply toward the western valley, avoiding the eastern forest completely. Adrian watched until the bird disappeared beyond the mountains. Behind them, Emily had also witnessed the same flight from the opposite side of the courtyard. For the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Castle, she allowed herself the smallest trace of concern to appear in her eyes. Whatever ancient force was disturbing the balance of the forest had begun changing the behavior of every living creature around it. Most people still dismissed those signs as coincidence. Emily knew better. And although neither of them spoke a single word across the distance separating them, Adrian found himself wondering why the quiet woman everyone underestimated always seemed to recognize the truth before anyone else could even see the question. By the 4th morning, the eastern forest no longer looked mysterious. It looked patient. From the highest balcony of Blackthorn Castle, Emily Carter watched the first light of dawn spread across the endless sea of towering pines. Golden sunlight touched the treetops, but beneath the thick canopy, the shadows refused to move. A cool breeze drifted toward the castle carrying the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth, yet another fragrance lingered beneath it, subtle enough that almost no one would notice. Emily recognized it immediately. The forest floor had been disturbed again during the night. Somewhere beyond the visible trails, something had quietly altered the balance of the wilderness. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the wind to speak in its own silent language before opening them with calm determination. The castle slowly awakened behind her as bells announced the beginning of another day. Guards assembled in the courtyard while Captain Rowan Hale reviewed assignments for the next patrol. Fresh reports had arrived before sunrise, and every messenger carried the same unsettling news. Travelers had begun avoiding the eastern roads without being instructed to do so. Hunters who knew the region better than anyone else suddenly refused to cross certain trails. None of them described danger. They simply claimed that the forest no longer felt familiar. Inside the Great Hall, King Adrian Blackwood studied the growing collection of reports spread across the long oak table. Each parchment described different locations, different witnesses, and different circumstances, yet every account carried the same invisible thread. Instinct. Rowan rested both hands upon the table. Your Majesty, I recommend sending another patrol before rumors spread beyond the border. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. Not another large patrol. Too many people create too much noise. Choose only experienced scouts who know how to observe before acting. Rowan agreed immediately and departed to prepare the expedition. As the meeting ended, Adrian noticed Emily crossing the courtyard below. She paused only once, kneeling beside a patch of freshly turned soil near one of the castle gardens. A tiny line of woodland ants had unexpectedly changed direction, abandoning their usual path toward the eastern wall. Emily watched them for several quiet seconds before standing once again. Adrian had never seen anyone pay such careful attention to details that everyone else ignored. Later that afternoon, the selected scouts departed through the eastern gate beneath clear skies. Their horses disappeared into the forest, while castle life continued with its ordinary rhythm. Merchants bargained over supplies, children laughed near the market square, and musicians played cheerful melodies beside the fountain. Yet Emily found herself unable to enjoy the peaceful afternoon. The silence beyond the walls felt heavier with every passing hour. She wandered toward the old library tower where tall windows overlooked the distant forest from above. Ancient maps covered the walls, showing forgotten trade routes, abandoned villages, and mountain passes that no longer appeared on modern charts. Emily quietly studied one faded map depicting the eastern woodland generations earlier. Several narrow paths had once crossed deep into the forest before suddenly ending without explanation. There were no notes describing why they disappeared. Only empty spaces remained where roads had once existed. A faint expression of recognition crossed her face before the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the stone hallway. Rowan entered the library carrying another message. Your Majesty has returned to the council chamber, he announced to the attending scholars. The patrol has sent word. Emily carefully returned the old map to its place before following the others at a respectful distance. Inside the council chamber, Adrian accepted the sealed letter from a royal messenger. He broke the wax seal and quietly read the contents while the room waited in complete silence. His calm expression changed only slightly, but Rowan immediately noticed it. The scouts reached the first checkpoint, Adrian finally said. After that, their tracks simply disappear. Their horses were found calmly grazing beside the trail, but the riders were nowhere nearby. A murmur spread across the room as advisors exchanged uncertain glances. Some suggested that the scouts had become lost. Others believed they had chosen another route. Emily remained silent because neither explanation matched what the forest had been saying since the day she arrived. As everyone debated possibilities, she quietly stepped toward one of the chamber windows overlooking the eastern horizon. High above the endless trees, dozens of white cranes suddenly changed direction in perfect unison, abandoning their southern migration to fly west instead. Emily watched until the last bird vanished into the afternoon sky. Behind her, the discussion continued, but she no longer listened. The forest had stopped whispering. It had begun giving warnings that even the sky could not ignore, and deep within her heart, she knew she could not remain inside the safety of the castle much longer while the answers waited beneath the ancient trees. Long before the castle bells welcomed the sunrise, Emily Carter quietly opened the door to her chamber and stepped into the silent corridor. Moonlight still rested across the stone floor as the last stars faded above the towers of Blackthorn Castle. She carried no heavy equipment and wore only a dark traveling cloak over simple clothes that allowed her to move comfortably through the forest. Anyone who happened to see her would have believed she intended to enjoy a peaceful morning walk before breakfast. No one would have guessed that every step she took had already been carefully planned. She crossed the sleeping courtyard without drawing attention, passing the quiet stables where several horses watched the eastern gate with unusual alertness. Even the oldest mare refused to lower her head to eat. Emily gently rested her hand against the wooden fence for a brief moment before continuing forward. Animals often recognized changes long before people accepted them, and this morning every instinct around the castle pointed toward the same destination. The eastern forest waited beneath a blanket of silver mist. Beyond the walls, the familiar road gradually disappeared beneath towering pine trees, whose branches filtered the first rays of dawn into scattered ribbons of golden light. Emily followed the main trail only briefly before leaving it entirely. Her eyes searched the ground instead of the path ahead. A broken fern bent in the wrong direction. Fresh moss had been brushed aside along the base of an ancient oak. Tiny drops of morning dew remained untouched on one side of a low branch, while the opposite side had already dried. Someone had passed through the forest recently without leaving obvious footprints, yet the surrounding plants quietly revealed the hidden route. Emily continued deeper between the trees with steady confidence, allowing the woodland itself to guide her. Several miles away, King Adrian Blackwood stood inside the castle courtyard preparing another search party after receiving no further messages from the missing scouts. Captain Rowan Hale adjusted the saddle on his horse before approaching the king. The eastern roads remain unusually quiet, Rowan reported. No merchants have arrived since yesterday, and local villagers are choosing longer routes around the forest. Adrian looked toward the distant tree line, where morning fog still covered the lower hills. Sometimes silence tells us more than noise, he answered thoughtfully. Before mounting his horse, his gaze instinctively drifted toward the castle windows. Emily's chamber overlooked the eastern walls, but the curtains remained gently open, revealing an empty room. Adrian paused for only a second before dismissing the observation as coincidence. Meanwhile, Emily moved deeper into the forest where the air grew cooler beneath towering evergreens. The usual songs of woodland birds had almost completely vanished, replaced by a peaceful stillness that felt strangely deliberate rather than natural. She knelt beside a narrow stream flowing over smooth gray stones. The water remained perfectly clear, yet dozens of tiny fish lingered beneath the opposite bank instead of swimming freely through the current. Emily smiled faintly. "You know something?" she whispered softly, although no one stood nearby to hear her. She crossed the stream using a fallen cedar log before climbing a gentle ridge overlooking an untouched valley. There she stopped. The forest floor appeared ordinary at first glance, but after several quiet moments, she noticed a nearly invisible line of flattened grass stretching between clusters of wildflowers. It was not a road. It was a forgotten passage carefully hidden by time and nature. Anyone searching quickly would have walked directly past it. Emily slowly crouched, brushing aside a thin layer of leaves with careful fingertips. Beneath them rested a small silver clasp shaped like an arrowhead engraved with an unfamiliar symbol worn smooth by age. She held it beneath the morning light, studying the elegant design as distant memories stirred quietly within her. It did not belong to soldiers from Blackthorn Kingdom. It did not belong to neighboring merchants either. Someone skilled had traveled this hidden route long before the recent disappearances began. Emily carefully placed the clasp inside her cloak instead of leaving it behind. She rose to her feet and looked farther into the valley where the concealed passage continued between enormous stone pillars wrapped in climbing ivy. The trail almost seemed to invite only those capable of noticing what everyone else overlooked. Far behind her, The sounds of Adrian's search party echoed faintly through another section of the forest, separated by ridges and winding streams. Neither realized how close their paths had become. Emily took one slow breath before stepping onto the forgotten trail. With every step, the ordinary forest faded behind her, and the hidden story waiting beneath centuries of silence finally began to reveal its first secret. The forgotten passage wound quietly through the valley until the towering trees gradually gave way to a circle of weathered stone pillars covered in emerald moss. Morning sunlight filtered through narrow openings in the ancient canopy, illuminating patterns carved into the stones that had almost disappeared beneath centuries of vines and climbing ivy. Emily Carter slowed her steps, allowing her eyes to adjust not only to the changing light, but also to the subtle details hidden within the ruins. The silence here felt different from the uneasy stillness surrounding the rest of the eastern forest. It was calm, deliberate, and strangely welcoming. She reached one of the nearest pillars and gently brushed away a layer of moss with her fingertips. Beneath it emerged the same arrow-shaped symbol engraved on the silver clasp she had discovered only minutes earlier. The matching design confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. This place had not been abandoned by accident. It had been hidden intentionally. Emily continued deeper into the sanctuary until she found the remains of a circular stone platform surrounding a crystal-clear spring. Wildflowers had reclaimed much of the ancient courtyard, while ivy embraced crumbling walls that still stood with quiet dignity against the passage of time. A family of white doves rested peacefully along the broken archway, showing no fear as Emily approached. Their calm presence told her something important. Whatever mystery surrounded this place, it was not one born from malice. Near the edge of the spring, half concealed beneath fallen leaves, rested an old wooden chest protected by age rather than locks. Emily carefully lifted the weathered lid. Inside lay several leather-bound journals preserved with remarkable care, their pages yellowed but still intact. Beside them rested a finely crafted compass unlike any she had ever seen, its silver needle remaining perfectly steady despite the gentle mountain breeze. She opened the first journal with respectful hands. The elegant handwriting spoke of generations who had studied the balance between kingdoms and the forests that connected them. They described themselves not as conquerors or warriors, but as guardians whose greatest strength came from observation, patience, and understanding. One sentence, written more boldly than the rest, caught Emily's attention. It read, "The greatest hunter is the one who protects what others fail to see." She quietly repeated the words beneath her breath, feeling an unexpected familiarity settle within her heart. Outside the sanctuary, sunlight continued climbing across the valley as distant footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the surrounding hills. Miles away, King Adrian Blackwood and Captain Rowan Hale followed faint traces left by the missing patrol. Their search had uncovered abandoned camps, untouched supplies, and trails that simply faded into the forest without explanation. Rowan knelt beside an unusual marking pressed into the soft earth. "Someone traveled here recently," he observed. Adrian studied the surrounding trees before noticing several branches that had been carefully moved aside rather than broken. Whoever had passed through possessed remarkable skill and deep respect for the forest itself. Back inside the sanctuary, Emily closed the journal and looked around the peaceful ruins once more. Every stone, every carving, and every quiet breeze seemed to preserve memories waiting for the right person to understand them. She slipped the silver clasp beside the journal before carefully placing both into her traveling satchel. As she turned toward the hidden path leading back through the valley, her eyes paused on a final engraving carved above the ancient archway. Time had nearly erased the words, but one symbol remained perfectly clear. It was the same arrow-shaped mark resting inside her satchel. Emily smiled softly, realizing that the forgotten sanctuary had not merely revealed an old legend. It had quietly recognized her long before anyone inside Blackthorn Castle ever would. Emily Carter left the hidden sanctuary just as the afternoon sun began slipping toward the western mountains, carrying the weathered journal and silver compass safely inside her satchel. The forgotten trail seemed easier to follow on the return journey, as though the ancient forest itself had accepted her presence. Soft rays of golden light filtered through towering pines while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh rain, even though the sky remained perfectly clear. She paused beside the narrow stream she had crossed earlier that morning and noticed something she had overlooked before. Small stacks of smooth river stones rested quietly along the bank, arranged with deliberate care instead of by nature. To most travelers they appeared meaningless, but Emily immediately recognized them as silent markers, subtle signs left only for those who understood how to read the language of forgotten paths. Someone had preserved this route across generations without disturbing the balance of the forest. At nearly the same time, several miles away, King Adrian Blackwood and Captain Rowan Hale reached the edge of the same valley from another direction. Their search party had discovered almost nothing except faint clues that vanished whenever they believed they were getting closer to an answer. Rowan dismounted beside an ancient cedar whose trunk bore a weathered carving nearly hidden beneath layers of moss. He carefully brushed away the surface with his glove before freezing in surprise. An elegant arrow-shaped symbol slowly emerged beneath the green covering. "Your Majesty," Rowan called quietly. "I have never seen this crest before." Adrian stepped closer and studied the engraving with thoughtful eyes. The symbol stirred a distant memory from old royal records he had read years earlier, stories dismissed by many historians as little more than forgotten legends. They spoke of a hidden order whose members understood the wilderness better than any army, individuals capable of finding what others overlooked simply by listening to the natural world. Adrian remained silent, but a question that had quietly followed him since Emily arrived at Blackthorn Castle suddenly became much harder to ignore. Back inside the castle before sunset, Emily entered through a small side gate after carefully avoiding the attention of the returning guards. The household remained busy preparing for the evening meal, allowing her to cross the courtyard unnoticed. Once inside her chamber, she placed the journal upon the wooden table beside the silver clasp and slowly opened its final pages. Unlike the earlier entries describing forests and kingdoms, these pages contained detailed observations about remarkable individuals who inherited extraordinary instincts through generations of careful teaching rather than noble birth. One passage described a young apprentice whose greatest gift was not unmatched strength or speed, but the ability to notice the smallest change in the living world before anyone else. Emily traced the faded handwriting with gentle fingertips as childhood memories quietly surfaced. Lessons beneath towering trees. Hours spent listening to the wind instead of speaking. A patient voice reminding her that true guardians protected balance before seeking recognition. She closed the journal softly, understanding that these memories were not distant stories after all. They belonged to her own forgotten past. Moments later, a respectful knock sounded at her chamber door. Emily carefully returned the journal to her satchel before inviting the visitor inside. Captain Rowan entered with a polite bow. "His Majesty requests your presence at tomorrow morning's council meeting," he said warmly. "He wishes everyone to hear the latest developments concerning the Eastern Forest." Emily thanked him with her usual calm smile. After Rowan departed, she walked toward the window, overlooking the endless line of ancient pines now glowing beneath the colors of sunset. Far beyond the castle walls, the hidden sanctuary rested in peaceful silence, waiting for the day its full story would finally be understood. Inside the castle, Adrian stood alone upon the eastern battlements holding a parchment on which Rowan had carefully sketched the mysterious arrow symbol. He compared it with old notes preserved inside the royal archives, and for the first time the pieces began fitting together. The quiet woman everyone believed had been traded to secure peace might instead be connected to the oldest mystery his kingdom had ever forgotten. The following morning, the council chamber filled earlier than usual as advisors, captains, and senior officials gathered around the great oak table overlooking the eastern forest. Maps covered nearly every surface, each marked with abandoned campsites, interrupted trade routes, and unexplained changes reported by scouts over the past several weeks. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting shifting colors across the stone floor, while an uneasy silence settled over the room. King Adrian Blackwood stood at the head of the table, studying the collection of reports before lifting his eyes toward those assembled. "The forest is changing," he said calmly. "Whether we understand the reason or not, we can no longer dismiss these signs as coincidence. Several advisors exchanged uncertain glances before one elderly noble cleared his throat. Your Majesty, perhaps fear has simply spread among the villages. Rumors often grow larger than reality. Adrian listened respectfully, but did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward Captain Rowan Hale. Rowan carefully unrolled another parchment containing the latest observations gathered only hours before sunrise. 3 separate patrols reported the same pattern, Rowan explained. Wildlife continues avoiding the eastern valleys. Birds have altered their migration paths, and local hunters claim familiar trails now lead them in unexpected directions. Before another debate could begin, the chamber doors opened quietly as Emily Carter entered with composed grace. The room briefly fell silent. Some nobles still viewed her as an outsider whose only purpose had been to fulfill a political agreement. Yet Adrian noticed something different. She carried herself with quiet confidence that seemed untouched by the opinions surrounding her. Adrian invited her to join the discussion without ceremony. Emily stepped closer to the maps spread across the table and studied the marked locations in silence. After several thoughtful moments, she gently moved one wooden marker several inches farther south. Then she adjusted another toward the western ridge. The advisors looked at one another in confusion. Those are not the reported locations, one of them objected politely. Emily met his gaze with calm sincerity. No, she answered softly. Those are the places where people believe they were standing. The forest has guided them away from the true paths. A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. Rowan looked back at the reports before comparing them with Emily's changes. To his surprise, the revised pattern connected every abandoned campsite into a single curved route leading toward the same isolated valley. Adrian slowly stepped beside her, studying the newly revealed path. How did you see this? He asked. Emily looked toward the eastern windows where distant pine forests shimmered beneath the morning light. Because the forest protects its oldest secrets by changing the journey instead of changing the destination, she replied. No one spoke for several long seconds. The explanation sounded impossible, yet the pattern before them suddenly made more sense than every previous theory combined. Adrian felt the final pieces of an invisible puzzle quietly settling into place. The mysterious arrow symbol, the forgotten carvings, the unusual instincts Emily had displayed since her arrival, and now this hidden route all pointed toward the same conclusion. She understood the wilderness in a way no ordinary traveler could. After the meeting ended, Adrian walked beside Emily through the castle gardens where roses climbed ancient stone walls and a gentle breeze carried the fragrance of cedar from the distant hills. You recognized something in that valley before any of us, he said. Emily remained silent for a moment before answering with complete honesty. I recognized a place that remembers those who know how to listen. Adrian studied her expression but found no trace of pride or deception, only quiet certainty. High above them, a single white hawk glided across the bright blue sky before turning toward the eastern forest and disappearing beyond the towering pines. Both of them watched until it vanished from sight. Neither realized that, with every shared conversation and every hidden truth brought into the light, destiny was quietly drawing the Wolf King and the forgotten hunter toward the same path that had been waiting for them long before either of them was born. The afternoon sun settled gently across the towers of Blackthorn Castle as a quiet sense of hope replaced the uncertainty that had lingered over the kingdom for so many days. Standing upon the eastern battlements, King Adrian Blackwood looked beyond the endless sea of ancient pines, no longer searching for an invisible threat, but recognizing that the forest had been protecting a forgotten truth all along. Beside him stood Emily Carter, her emerald eyes reflecting the golden light as a cool breeze carried the familiar scent of cedar through the air. Neither of them spoke for several moments because some discoveries were too meaningful to interrupt with unnecessary words. Adrian finally turned toward her with a calm expression that carried both gratitude and respect. When you first arrived, he said quietly, everyone believed you had been sent here because your kingdom had nothing else to offer. Emily smiled gently, not with pride, but with quiet understanding. Sometimes people only recognize value after they stop looking for appearances, she replied. Adrian nodded slowly. You were never the kingdom's sacrifice. His voice became even steadier. You were its greatest gift. At that moment, Captain Rowan Hale approached carrying the weathered journal that had been carefully preserved inside the royal archives after Emily shared the forgotten sanctuary with the king. Several royal scholars had spent the morning comparing its pages with centuries of historical records. Every detail matched. The mysterious arrow symbol, the hidden pathways, the forgotten sanctuary, and the teachings of the ancient guardians had all been real. More remarkably, the journal described a final generation entrusted with preserving that knowledge until someone worthy returned to continue their purpose. Rowan respectfully handed the journal to Adrian before saying, "Your Majesty, there is no doubt remaining. The legends were true." Adrian looked toward Emily with quiet admiration. Then Blackthorn Kingdom owes its future to someone everyone underestimated. News of the discovery gradually spread throughout the castle. The same nobles who had once whispered behind Emily's back now greeted her with sincere respect. The servants smiled warmly whenever she passed through the halls, while the younger guards listened carefully whenever she shared observations about the forest. She never demanded recognition, and perhaps that was why she earned it so naturally. In the weeks that followed, the forgotten sanctuary was preserved rather than disturbed, allowing its wisdom to guide a new partnership between the kingdom and the wilderness surrounding it. Adrian invited Emily to help establish a council dedicated to protecting both the people and the ancient forests, believing that lasting peace required understanding instead of fear. Standing together at the edge of the eastern valley, they watched birds once again fill the morning sky as deer returned to familiar meadows and gentle streams flowed peacefully through the ancient woods. The forest no longer felt distant. It felt understood. Emily looked toward the hidden trail one final time before turning back toward the castle that had slowly become her home. She realized that destiny had never asked her to become someone different. It had simply waited for the world to finally recognize who she had always been. Sometimes the strongest protector arrives wearing the simplest cloak. Sometimes the quietest voice carries the greatest wisdom. And sometimes the person treated like a bargain becomes the one who changes an entire kingdom forever. If Emily's journey reminded you that true strength is found in kindness, patience, and quiet courage, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story with someone who believes that hidden potential deserves to be seen. Tell us in the comments what moment touched you the most, and whether you believe King Adrian recognized Emily's true worth at exactly the right time or much later than he should have. Your thoughts become part of every story we continue to tell together.